Hey, motherfuckers, it's Bone Gun. This is going to be a part two of the video I did earlier talking about the atrocities that the Palefaces, as a collective, committed onto the melanated beings of the cosmos, really. Um, But before I finish with the atrocities, I would like to explain. So, this part two probably should have been part one, but I wasn't thinking like that. So, I kind of did part two before part one. So, we're going to do a little reverse. No big deal. But the question could be, well, I feel like you're inciting hatred. A lot of people call me racist. Now, let's talk about racism, right? By definition, I could not be racist. By definition, no black people could be racist. Because in order to be racist, again, by definition, it would be a individual or group of individuals that have a personal bias against another individual or group of individuals, as it is in our case, that they are in a position of authority where they can use their authority to exact that um, personal bias onto those people, i.e., banking industry, housing, medicine, food, um, school. You know what I mean? Because they are in a position of authority, they can then use their hatred for us against us, basically. So black people are not in a position of authority like that right now. And when we were in a position of authority, they were nothing to us. We're not even concerned with them. You know what I mean? Because they were insignificant. What's a god to? I mean, what's a devil to a god? You know what I mean? Nothing, basically. Anyways, so the question would be, well, why is any of this? Why is it important to know these things? Well, for one, it's always good to educate yourself, right? Especially when you're living in fucking America. You should know who you're up against, right? You really should. But most of you don't, and you don't care. And that's a problem that will be attended to very soon. But not by who you think. As a collective, we failed. We failed our planet. We failed each other. We failed our community. We failed the test. It's not good. We're probably going to get a D on this report card, but don't worry. There's always next time. Well, hopefully next time will be better. In any case, it's important to know who our open enemy is. And I say that because we really are at war. And we've always been at war, technically. Ever since they got here, we've been at war. Um, this was our land. This land was already inhabited. Thank you, Dane Calloway, for presenting that information. Very powerful brother. I definitely recommend him. Um, so we were already here, which I'm not surprised. You know what I mean? I really am not. We are such an amazing creature. You guys just don't even know who you are. That drives me crazy too. I try to tell black folks who they are a little bit, and they don't like it. They're like, ah, that's not true. You don't know what you're talking about. And so I'll say, well, have you ever researched the subject? Oh, well, no, I've never researched the subject. Okay. So you never researched the subject, but you know that I'm wrong. So what sense does that make? I'll tell you what sense that makes. It's called ignorance. Ignorance argues. Knowledge, wisdom, and knowledge listens and learns, right? Those of us that strive for knowledge and wisdom, we learn from each other. We don't argue. There's no reason to argue, right? Uh, and we don't assume that we already know everything, even though I know I'm very intelligent, but I never go into a conversation assuming that I'm the most intelligent or that I know everything. Oh, hell no. I go in there humble, ready to learn. You know what I mean? It could be a good conversation. You could walk away with a lot of good tidbits. But for the largely, most of you, you don't want to be educated. You don't want to know who you are. And it's just really slowing this process even more, which we really should have been out of here by now. But we can't because the mainstream consciousness is still fucking in the 1960s, right? That's why this community is still using MLK and Malcolm X as civil rights leaders and stuff like this. Like, come on, y'all. We can't move to 2022. We can't do that. You know what I mean? No, they're still stuck in 1962. Anyways, we need to know. You need to understand the level of depravity of these creatures, because if you don't know what they've done, you don't know what they still do and what they're capable of. You don't understand it. You know what I mean? And until you understand the depravity, you're not gonna be able to stay. I mean, you're not gonna know. I mean, it's for your own safety, honestly. Truthfully, when you understand Christ as a title, and the only Christed ones can only be melanated individuals, and Christed is just a title that is referring to spiritual ascension. But if you're talking about a Christed one, since they can only be melanated, we would say the Antichrist is the opposite of us. Well, who is the opposite of us, right? And when I say opposite, that means that as much as we love is as much as they hate. It's hard for us to understand that, because we're a very loving, peaceful, people. You know what I mean? So we don't really understand the levels of hate that they go to. You know what I mean? And I think Dr. Cress Wilson was most profound when she was talking about white genetic annihilation. And so basically, their hatred is spawned in. We are their kryptonite, essentially. But they were never supposed to be here like this, anyways. You know what I mean? They were a recessive gene in nature that, like all albinos, they're supposed to reproduce with the archetype of the original archetype of the area of that species. You know what I mean? Which would be melanated individuals, and then return to the archetype, right? So they were never meant to remain the way they are, and they've had to do some very terrible things and continue to do some very terrible things. And so that's why you need to know what's going on, and that's why you need to understand what they've done and what they still do. Just because you don't hear about it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. And I think a lot of people make that mistake. They assume that because it's not in the news or in a magazine or in a movie or some bullshit like this, that it's not real. And the problem there is, the only thing that changes when you don't know something, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means you're not aware of it, right? And that's an important factor to understand, because your awareness does not change the existence of anything. Understand that first and foremost. Well, actually, technically, I take that back. As a collective, when our consciousness is combined, then it would. But right now, since we're all broken and divided, now it doesn't, right? Because we're not on the same collective consciousness. We're not on that same wavelength like we used to be. So until we return there, which of course is dependent upon the masses to wake up and realize there's no white Jesus coming to save you, and we are the gods and goddesses of the universe, and whether you like it or not, it's time to step up to the game, right? Period. So in doing so, you need to know who we're up against, because again, they're going to come at you with tactics. I mean, they put black neighborhoods around sewage places. I used to live in Wichita Falls, Texas, and the black neighborhood was also where they built the shit plant. You know what I mean? And I'm like, you know what? This is terrible, because there was a park there I used to go walking in, and Texas is, humid and hot. It would smell so bad. Now, if you can smell shit, understand that there are poisonous fumes in that. So not only can you smell something gross, it's also poisoning you, right? All done by design. All done by design. Keep that in mind, right? So you need to know these things so that you know how to maneuver, especially in the upcoming days, because as things get excuse me as things begin to collapse, and the social infrastructure, if there ever was one in this particular society, if there ever was one, as that collapses, people are going to turn on each other. I mean, they already are. You know what I mean? They already are. But I'm talking on a main. It'll be mass. It'll be like purge, anarchy. You know what I mean? It's going to get nuts. So you just need to know what you're up against. And even though, unfortunately, there are so many broken black folks right now that they're just as dangerous as the white folks are. In some cases, more dangerous. You also need to understand the associates of the pale faces, the Hispanics, Asians, Arabs. You know what I mean? Maybe not all of them, but as a collective, they take on the role of the pale faces. So you got to understand that they are not our friends either. So the sooner we can come together, the better. You know, things would definitely be, of course. But let's continue with our discussion about some of the atrocities that that they did. And there was one earlier that I still have not. I wanted to talk about it, and for the life of me, I cannot remember what the fuck it was. But it was very important. It was very, very important. Well, I can tell you another one that they used to do. Again, so their goal is to traumatize us, and of course to torture us, do experiments. It's really some sick shit, honestly. But one of the things they would do is they would take usually, I mean, when they colonized here, what basically the role was, they killed off the elders and they enslaved the children, and that way the children don't have the knowledge of the elders to know who they are, where they come from, none of that stuff. So basically, the pale faces indoctrinated the children with what they wanted them to believe. It just made for an easier slave that way. You know what I mean? So a lot of times, what they were doing was being done onto children. You know what I mean? Or young men, also young women, but mostly the torture stuff was done to usually men. You know what I mean? And little boys and stuff like that. Girls were usually raped and impregnated. I mean, I'm not gonna lie about that. But it was brutal. I mean, it would have been brutal. Oh man. Anyways, so one of the tortures they would do is they would tie a brother, usually a small child or a young man, to the ground so that his arms are spread out and his legs are spread out. He's butt naked, and he's on the dirt. He's on the ground dirt, right? And then they would proceed to skin him alive. Now, I don't know if you have ever ripped a piece of your skin off, but it hurts like hell. And to be skinned alive would be a nightmare. But even worse than that, you were left in that position. Now, keep in mind, you will die from that, but it's not going to be immediate. I mean, you have none of your major arteries or veins are superficial in your skin. They are deeper into your subcutaneous tissue and into your muscle tissue. So you couldn't even bleed. I mean, you would eventually bleed to death because of the capillaries, but the capillaries are very small. So you don't have any like major capillaries that you're going to slice and you're going to die from bleeding out from that immediately. It will happen, but it takes time. And they knew that. So in the interim of all this, your nerve endings are literally exposed to the environment. Bugs, animals, they're eating you. They're eating you alive while you're skinned. That's what they used to do to small black children, black men. You understand? I mean, they had collars that they would put on enslaved people because they could not get. I mean, keep in mind, we come from a warrior class, y'all. So we didn't go down easily. Just keep that in mind. Of course, their history is not going to tell you that because their history wants to make you think that they were always, on top. But no, many times we massacred the whole farm. You know what I'm saying? Took it over. Anyways, they would put these collars on the enslaved folks that many of them were very sharp, right? So basically, if you were to put your head down, it would slice your throat, honestly. They also had one that was very heavy, so if you would try to lay down, it would snap your neck. Because basically they want to work you to death. Oh, that's what I wanted to tell you. I knew I would remember it. So I was watching this program about now I used to be a physical therapy assistant, so I'm always kind of into musculoskeletal injuries, conditions, fractures, stuff of this nature. And so I was watching this archaeological program, and they were talking about one of these mass graveyards of slave bones that they had found. And they were talking about the most common type of fracture that they found on these bones, right? The most common type of fracture was an avulsion fracture. Now, an avulsion fracture, you ask, what is that? Okay, I'll tell you. In my almost 20-year career, I've only ever seen one avulsion fracture. But back then, it was the most common fracture. An avulsion fracture occurs when the tendon, now keep in mind, you have a muscle, the muscle becomes more fibrous and more tough as it attaches to the bone so that you cannot pull because muscle is a little bit softer, so it would be more easy to pull that from a bone. But tendon is not. Tendon is very tough, right? Especially your Achilles tendon. And the most common place the avulsion fracture would occur was the Achilles tendon. So what's happening here is the tendon is literally ripped off the bone. They were worked so hard, their tendons were ripped off the bone. Are you kidding me? Do you know how incredibly painful that would be? I mean, the only person that I took care of with that type of fracture, he was a football player, and he got hit wrong, and that's how his tendon got ripped off. He wasn't working like that. But these folks, they were worked to that point. That's very scary when you think about that, because an avulsion fracture, I mean, it's very, and it's fatal. I mean, back then it would have been fatal, because if you rip off your tendon from your heel, basically what's going to happen is that tendon, the Achilles tendon, because it's so big and tough, it's going to rip off the back of your heel bone. So you're not going to be able to walk anymore. Your wound is going to be open. It's probably going to be a compound fracture, so that your skin is also busted, and you can wrap it, but you can't set it. You can't reset tendon to bone. It doesn't work that way. I mean, surgically now they can do it, but you can't. It was not possible back then, right? So it would not. Basically, being worked to that degree was a death sentence. Honestly, it was. So that was a very terrible thing. I mean, when you realize, you just think about. I know most of you can't practice critical thinking. It's very sad too. I feel bad for you, but if you can, just think about the pain associated with having your Achilles tendon ripped from your foot because you were worked that hard, right? Yeah, that was the most common skeletal fracture. and so you can imagine if they were worked hard enough to rip tendon from bone, very easily they were worked to the point where their muscles were ripping. You have to understand, because your muscles are a lot softer than your tendons are. So if your tendons ripped, your muscle is probably also ripped as well. So I don't know if you've ever torn one of your muscles. That bitch hurts like hell, right? Now, you maybe only did like a partial tear, maybe 30 or 40% of the muscle, maybe. It heals on its own for the most part. But if you've got a 60 or 70% muscle tear, it would require surgery. And if you couldn't get surgery, your muscle is going to be ineffective. It's not going to work anymore. Because normally, that muscle is going to rip at the muscle belly, which is kind of like the softest, squishiest part of the muscle. And it's going to be that softest point of connection. So that would be the point that it would rip from, usually, if it's going to rip, you know what I mean? And I just couldn't imagine that. I just couldn't imagine that. So we need to understand the fact that somebody could do that. Something. I don't really consider them human. They're definitely not human. But something could do that to a beautiful, beautiful species like us. It's just absolutely horrific. And I just have a hard time even fathoming it. But fortunately, the ancestors show me images, and also they take me there. So I have a kind of a first-hand experience as to what happened and how it happened, what things look like. But you can understand that there would be very often times when, of course, nobody wants to be enslaved, so they would try to run away. Now, because insurance companies were around back then, and they were owned by white Jews, of course, and they were insuring the slave owners, so that if their slave was injured or killed, they would get money for that slave. So they didn't really care if the slave died or not, because either way they're going to get paid, right? So what would happen is, um, they would sick the dogs on them. You know what I mean? And the dogs would eat them alive. I don't know if you've ever seen a dog eat before, but it would be terrible. And that death would be incredibly slow. I mean, we're talking about, you're not going to die until they get a major artery, and then you're going to bleed out. Now, hopefully, it occurs quickly, but I am not convinced that's how that would go down. I'm convinced that that type of a death would probably take upwards of an hour, 2 hours, something like that. It just depends on how long it takes until they get a major artery or vein. But or if they got like your throat, rip your throat out or something along those lines, then death would be pretty instant. But otherwise, you're alive the whole time they're eating you. They're taking bites out of your muscle. That's where your nerve endings are, your skin, your muscle. So shit, every bite you feel, honestly. And if you've ever been bitten by a dog before, that shit hurts. Now just imagine that on a large scale by 6 or 7, 8 different dogs. Huge dogs. They would watch somebody be eaten by dogs. Now, let me tell you their pinnacle. So this is an interesting one. I don't know if you know what a picnic is. Well, most of you probably do. But I don't know if you know where that actually came from, right? So a picnic actually originated as pick a nigger. And so what would happen is, they would now keep in mind, this is a whole town event. They're sending out brochures to each other, invites. They're planning dinners. I mean, they've got the dinner is going to be the person, honestly, because they're going to bring the grill, because it's going to be a lynching or a burning. Either way, they're going to eat the person when they're done. In most cases, not all, but most. So that's the dinner, actually, and also souvenirs. They used to sell black body parts as souvenirs, and I believe very much so that there are many pale-face homes that still have those souvenirs. I mean, you have to understand, people, they don't change like that, right? So anyways, Sunday after church, again, this is a planned event. They would have picked and usually it was a small young boy, maybe 14, 15, maybe 20, somewhere around there. And it wasn't somebody that was even bad. They didn't really kill people that did bad, because they would put them in jail and use them as slaves. But the ones that were they were intelligent, they were making money, they had businesses, those were the ones that would be lynched. So they have this small child, 14, 15, something like that. Now, before he gets lynched, now keep in mind, there's a difference between lynching and hanging. I'll get to that in a minute, but let me explain before what happens. They're going to torture and many times it's going to be a sexual assault, and then they're going to torture the child. You know what I mean? Like I told you in the first video, they're gouging out your eyes, they're cutting off your nose, they're cutting off your lips, they're cutting off your ears, they're cutting off your fingers, they're cutting off your feet, your toes, your genitals. Very often they would put the genitals in the person's mouth as an insult to them. But they're basically tortured, but long before they're lynched, right? So, or if they were burned alive, they would still be tortured before they were burned alive, because, like I said, the body parts, not only did they eat the body parts, but they also sold them or gave them away as souvenirs. So this is Sunday after their church service. Keep that in mind. And it's everybody, man, women, and children, and they're all dressed up, you know what I mean, in their Sunday best, coming to see this young black child be tortured and lynched. So let's talk about the difference between a lynching and a hanging. A hanging occurs when, usually it would be in the gallows, or some type of a platform where when they kick the stool out, like you're up on like a stool or something, that stool will be kicked out, you will drop down, and death will usually occur because the force of you falling down is going to snap your cervical vertebrae, which if you snap C1, C2, C3, C4, death will be instantaneous. But if you don't, then you will suffocate. Your death will be asphyxiation, which will be very slow. When you asphyxiate to death, number one, you feel it the whole time until you pass out. But it takes, like movies, they don't show you the real how long it really takes for death to occur, right? You're talking 8, 10, 15 minutes, and it's going to feel like 10 years because you're going to be in so much pain. It would just be absolutely terrible. But a lynching is different. So lynching occurs when a rope is thrown over a tree branch, usually, or some type of a leverage, you know what I mean? The person is on the ground, right? Usually their arms are bound behind their back so they can't pull themselves up. Their legs are bound. Again, they're naked. They're all, every time they were going to torture black folks, they always make them naked because they're jealous of our genitals. So they love to see us naked. They love to rape us, but also cut off. They were just torturers. I mean, they still are, but it was just terrible. So lynching occurs when the individual, like I said, they're bound and they got the noose around their neck. The rope is over the branch, and then somebody pulls up that rope. So death does not occur because there's no dropping. So you don't even have a chance of having your C1 and C2 separated. The only way you're going to die is as asphyxiation. That's the difference between a hanging and a lynching. And they chose lynching for black folks. Just keep that in mind, right? So, you've got a melanated individual hanging from a tree, and that death is going to take 10 to 15 minutes easily. You know what I mean? It just depends on how big they were, and if it's a small child, it's going to take longer because their little bodies are, not necessarily longer, but it would just be terrible. You just couldn't even imagine the sight of it. You couldn't. And I told you that when my dad was a kid, when he would walk through the woods of Mississippi, he said you expected to see multiple dead black bodies hanging from trees. You expected to see that, right? Now, these are just some of the things that we know of. But God like I told you, because we are a good creature, we are bound by love and universal law. So our mentality is not to torture, right? Theirs is. So like I said, they are the Antichrist, right? So the opposite of us. So as much as we love is as much as they hate. So with that being said, you got to understand that there are things that the ancestors won't show me. Honestly, they already told me that. They wouldn't even show me how some terrible things. They had a torture where they had a box, like a coffin, but it was made of metal. It was buried about maybe 2 feet under the ground. It was deep enough where you were you were kind of under the ground, but not so much where they couldn't get you back out quickly. But anyways, they would leave you in there all day. You would be naked again, of course. Every time. For the most part, most slaves were naked, barefoot and naked. A, it was easier for them to rape you, and B, they just were so jealous of our bodies. They were trying to shame us, basically. But because we were, for us, because we're melanated and this planet is for us and the sun feeds us, the more skin we have exposed, the more sunlight our bodies can absorb, the healthier we are. So our ancestors didn't wear clothes like this because we were not designed to wear clothes. You know what I mean? Like, we are advanced beings that clothing is not necessary, right? So they wanted to shame that, make us feel bad for that. So they eventually succeeded in that, because many of you are ashamed of your bodies. I'm not. I like to go hiking naked personally. But anyways, so they would put you in this box, bury you a little bit, and they leave you in there all day. And you're talking about, what's the torture there? You're baking in the sun all day long. maybe for a couple of days, could be a week, just depends. Now, their goal was not really to kill you, but if you died, it didn't matter because the insurance companies paid them anyways. So it didn't matter to them. But they were trying to traumatize and torture black folks back then. These were the things that they were doing. Just keep that in mind, folks. Keep that in mind. So you would come out, you're in a metal box, so of course it's going to heat up in the sunlight. Your skin is burnt. You might have, you just could have a lot of problems. If you stop breathing or if the oxygen got too low, you could have potential brain damage. You just don't even know how you're going to come out of that box. I promise you that. And these were the things they did on a daily basis. I told you, most women, they started raping women at 2 years old. That was the law. Slave masters had to start raping little black girls at 2 years old. That was the law. Keep that in mind. So when you are following these fucking dumbass laws, just think about that. That their laws are not even real laws, number one, because they're not even real people. But number two, they were not designed to help. They were designed to hurt us. Always. It's always about hurting us. But most of you don't even realize that. And it's very sad to me because I'm like, hey, if you knew what we were up against, then it would be easier for us to unify. Because you would recognize that we got to protect ourselves and our kids and shit. Every 30 seconds, a black child disappears. Just keep that in mind. What happens to that black child? Well, let's talk about that. There are rituals. They are bloodthirsty. They are bloodthirsty creatures, honestly. And they have rituals where the deity that they worship eats humans. It's a cannibal, which is why Christianity has communion. What is communion? The pretend eating and drinking of Jesus' blood and flesh? That's disgusting. You tell me another time in history when cannibalism is acceptable. It's not, period, okay? At least in our existence, it's not acceptable. So the fact that you are participating in that is not, even though most of you don't believe me anyway, but that's not a good thing. You're participating in a satanic ritual where you are consuming human blood and flesh. Even if it's for pretend, it doesn't matter because it's still a ritual. And the ritual has powers. You have to understand that shit, right? So they regularly actually, I didn't finish the story about the lynchings and stuff. I'll go back there. So after the individual was tortured, raped, tortured, and finally lynched or burned alive, they had a big grill, and that big grill was already out there, So now they're gonna cut off body parts and they're gonna start grilling and they're gonna start eating. Again, if you have any doubt, the book Delectable Negro I recommend to you because it outlines all of these things, right? Also, another good movie that outlines that kind of stuff is Friday.